Welcome to tonight's journey. Take a slow, deep breath in, and like the long day, gently slip away. There is nowhere else you need to be right now, and nothing else you need to do. Just allow yourself to settle into the comfortable weight of your own body, resting softly against the space beneath you. Let your shoulders drop, and let the quietness of the room gather around you like a heavy, warm blanket. Tonight we are going to travel far back in time to a very calm and quiet place, and if you find yourself drifting off into sleep before our story ends, that is perfectly fine. Simply let the sound of the words carry you down into rest, knowing you are safe and secure. Now take one more deep, slow breath, and as you exhale, let the noise of the modern world fade away entirely. Tonight we journey back to the quiet valleys of 13th century Italy, where a young boy named Thomas looks out from a high stone window, watching the evening shadows slowly stretch across the earth, carrying with him a gentle, quiet curiosity that would one day map the very stars of human thought. The air high up in the mountains of central Italy is remarkably still as the day slowly gives way to the peaceful evening. We find ourselves in the ancient castle of Roccasecca, a vast and heavy fortress of pale gray stone that seems to grow directly out of the rocky hillside, rooted deep in the quiet earth. It is the winter of the year 1225, and the cold mountain air outside carries the faint, crisp scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke drifting up from the valley below. Outside the thick, impenetrable castle walls, the world is painted in deep, dusky blues and soft charcoal grays. The sun dips completely below the horizon, leaving behind a vast and open sky that is slowly dusted with the first pale, shimmering stars of the night. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere is entirely different, wrapping its inhabitants in a space of profound and quiet safety. The thick, ancient stone walls keep the chill of the evening safely outside, preserving a deeply comforting hush that settles over every room and hallway. In the long corridors, torches and iron lamps cast a warm, golden amber glow against the smooth rock, their gentle flickering creating soft, slow shadows that seem to dance in perfect time with the quiet breathing of the sleeping castle. The heavy wooden doors, bound in dark iron and smoothed by generations of hands, are closed tight against the night. Heavy, woven tapestries hang along the walls, absorbing any stray sounds and leaving only the muffled, rhythmic footsteps of the household slowly settling down for their rest. In one of the quietest rooms of this great stone sanctuary, sitting comfortably in the warm, golden light of a single candle, is the youngest son of the noble Aquino family. Even as a very small child, he is notably large, possessing a sturdy, heavy frame and moving with a slow, deliberate grace that sets him apart from the boisterous energy of his older brothers. While the other boys spend their afternoons running through the open courtyards with wooden swords, shouting and playing at the wars of nobility, Thomas prefers to sit in the quiet, undisturbed corners of the room, completely content in his own peaceful solitude. He does not need constant entertainment, nor does he crave the loud, busy attention of the adults around him. Instead, he simply observes the world with a gentle, unhurried focus that makes the space around him feel instantly calmer. He watches the way the dust motes drift lazily through the shafts of late afternoon light, floating suspended in the still air, and he listens to the steady, rhythmic patter of winter rain against the thick, leaded glass of the high windows. His family members sometimes worry about his silence, wondering why the young boy speaks so little. But his quietness is never a sign of emptiness or distance. It is a deep, comforting pool of thought, a mind that is simply taking its time to carefully gather and hold the pieces of a vast and beautiful mystery. Thomas possesses a natural, heavy stillness, a grounding presence that anchors him to the earth. When the castle is bustling with the loud preparations for a feast or the sudden arrival of traveling guests, the young boy can always be found tucked securely away in a dimly lit alcove, completely undisturbed by the commotion outside his door. He finds deep comfort in the slow, rhythmic turning of pages, sitting near the hearth while the embers glow softly in the dark. He traces the beautifully illuminated letters of old manuscripts with a soft, careful touch, letting the heavy, smooth parchment ground him in the present moment. Sometimes a quiet question will rise to the surface of his thoughts, and he will ask it with a gentle sincerity that leaves the adults pausing in quiet reflection. He asks what it means to know the Creator of the world, and his simple words linger softly in the quiet room like the last resonant note of a peaceful melody. As the evening deepens its hold on Roccasecca, the boy rests his head against the thick, cool stone sill of his window, watching the pale moonlight slowly wash over the sleeping, mist-covered valley below. The world outside is vast and silent, and the castle walls hold him in an embrace of absolute security. He breathes in the clean night air, letting his eyes grow heavy and his breathing slow to a steady, even rhythm, perfectly safe within the quiet fortress of his own gentle mind, ready for the slow, beautiful unfolding of the long years ahead. As the slow, quiet years of his early childhood gracefully unfolded, the time eventually came for young Thomas to journey just a short distance from the family home, traveling slowly up the winding mountain paths to the great and ancient Abbey of Monte Cassino. The transition was not a disruption, but rather a gentle stepping into a world that perfectly matched the natural stillness of his own soul. Set high upon a tranquil hilltop, completely separated from the noise and rush of the valleys below, the monastery was a vast sanctuary of pale stone, heavy wooden beams, and peaceful enclosed courtyards where the passage of time was measured only by the slow arc of the sun and the soft ringing of bells. Here the monks lived according to a very old and beautiful rhythm, a steady, predictable pattern of prayer, reading, and gentle labor that had gently guided the lives of countless men before them. For a quiet boy like Thomas, arriving at Monte Cassino felt like a deep and comforting exhale. A safe and ordered space where the silence he loved so much was not simply accepted, but actively cultivated and cherished as a pathway to the divine. The days at the Abbey began long before the sun even thought of painting the eastern sky, while the world was still wrapped in the thick, comforting blanket of night. Sometime in the deepest, quietest hours of the early morning, a single monk would walk softly through the stone corridors, ringing a small, clear bell to wake the community. Thomas and the other young boys, completely safe within the thick walls of their sleeping quarters, would rise slowly from their warm, simple beds, dressing quietly in the cool, refreshing night air. They wore heavy, dark wool that provided a soft, comforting warmth against the morning chill, and their leather sandals made a gentle, rhythmic shuffling sound against the smooth stone floors as they walked together in the dim light. They moved in a slow, peaceful procession toward the great Abbey church, guided only by the warm amber glow of a few solitary torches mounted along the walls, casting long, soft shadows that seemed to guide them on their way. Entering the vast chapel, the sheer size of the space felt grounding and secure, and as the monks took their places, a profound, unified silence settled over the room, preparing their minds for the first slow, beautiful notes of the morning chant. As the first low, resonant voices began to echo softly through the cavernous space, singing the ancient psalms that had been chanted in that exact room for generations, Thomas would let the sound wash over him like a warm, slow-moving river. The melodies were simple and unhurried, rising and falling in perfect, effortless harmony, carrying the heavy, sleep-filled minds of the congregation gently toward the dawn. The boy found deep comfort in this repetition, knowing exactly which words would follow, allowing his thoughts to rest securely within the familiar structure of the liturgy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the black glass of the high eastern windows would begin to soften into a deep, dusky blue, and then gradually transition into a pale, milky gray as the morning light finally touched the mountain. The shadows in the chapel would slowly recede, revealing the beautiful, worn edges of the wooden choir stalls and the smooth, polished stone of the altar, glowing softly in the quiet morning light. This transition from deep night to peaceful day was a daily reminder of the gentle, constant turning of the world, a rhythm that asked nothing of Thomas except his quiet, peaceful presence. Following the morning prayers and a simple, quiet meal shared in peaceful silence, the boys would gather in a warm, inviting room set aside for their lessons, surrounded by the comforting, earthy smell of old parchment, beeswax, and ancient wood. In the medieval world, reading was a slow, deliberate art, and the library at Monte Cassino was filled with heavy, leather-bound manuscripts that had been copied by hand over countless, unhurried hours. Thomas loved the physical sensation of these books, enjoying the smooth, cool touch of the thick vellum pages and the sound they made as they were turned, a soft, rich rustle that felt like a quiet conversation between the reader and the text. While other children might have grown restless with the repetitive study of Latin grammar and the slow, careful tracing of letters, Thomas absorbed the rules of language with a gentle, patient joy. He saw that grammar was simply a beautiful, logical structure, a quiet architecture of words that provided a safe and reliable way to organize the vast, boundless landscape of human thought. He would sit for hours at a heavy wooden desk, the morning sunlight slowly inching across the floor beside him, completely lost in the peaceful rhythm of writing, his mind expanding as naturally and effortlessly as a flower opening to the sun. As the years slowly passed and he grew taller, his studies gently expanded, introducing him to the quiet mysteries of mathematics, the harmonious ratios of music, and the beautiful, orderly paths of the stars. He learned that the entire universe was governed by a profound underlying harmony, a vast and complex symphony of celestial movements and natural laws that could be carefully observed and quietly understood. When he studied astronomy, he imagined the planets moving in their slow, perfect circles through the dark, velvety expanse of space, and this image filled him with a deep sense of calm and safety, knowing that the world was not chaotic, but guided by a gentle, purposeful hand. He approached logic not as a rigid set of rules, but as a clear, well-lit path through a quiet forest, a method of walking softly and carefully from one true thought to another, without ever losing his way. His mind was incredibly vast and capable, yet he never rushed his understanding, preferring to hold a new idea gently in his thoughts, turning it over slowly, examining it from every angle in the quiet sanctuary of his own reflection. Because he was so frequently lost in these deep, peaceful thoughts, and because his physical frame was growing large and heavy, moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace, some of the other children occasionally mistook his quiet nature for slowness. They noticed that he rarely volunteered an answer, choosing instead to listen softly to the voices around him, absorbing every word with a steady, unbroken attention. But those who looked closely, particularly the older monks who recognized the rare and beautiful quality of his attention, knew that his silence was simply a vessel, a spacious, empty room, waiting patiently to be filled with truth. When he did speak, it was never to boast or to dominate the conversation, but simply to share a thought so carefully considered and so warmly expressed that it settled easily into the minds of his listeners. It was during these quiet years, walking slowly through the stone cloisters or resting in the shade of a large ancient tree in the Abbey gardens, that a simple, profound question began to take root in his heart. He would occasionally look up at a passing monk, his eyes wide and deeply serene, and ask in a soft, gentle voice what God was. He did not demand an immediate answer, nor did he feel any anxiety or urgency in the asking, for he understood that some questions are like the slow-growing oak trees that surrounded the monastery, requiring many long, quiet years to reach their full, magnificent height. He was perfectly content to live within the gentle mystery of that question, letting it guide him softly through the peaceful, structured days of his youth. As the afternoon light would begin to fade, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, Thomas would listen to the final comforting bells of the evening, calling the community back to rest. The heavy wooden doors would close softly against the coming night. The candles would be extinguished one by one, and the young boy would settle once more into his quiet bed, wrapped securely in the cool mountain air, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing joining the vast, ancient silence of the great stone abbey, sleeping peacefully beneath a blanket of silver stars. as the slow turning of the years gracefully carried Thomas into his adolescence. A gentle shift in the world outside the protective walls of Monte Cassino meant that it was finally time for the young student to leave his familiar hilltop sanctuary. The transition was soft and entirely peaceful, a natural, unhurried progression that guided him slowly down the winding mountain paths, leaving behind the cool, thin air of the peaks for the warm coastal breezes of the south. He traveled at a gentle pace, watching the heavy green forests gradually give way to the ancient, sun-warmed city of Naples, resting beautifully by the edge of a vast and shimmering sea. Naples was a large and bustling port, a place where merchants from distant, unknown lands brought a continuous, swirling tide of movement and sound to the narrow, winding streets, filling the air with the scent of sea salt and warm bread. Yet for Thomas, the lively, constant energy of the city was never a source of overwhelm or distraction. He moved through the crowded cobblestone squares with his characteristic slow and deliberate grace, entirely anchored in his own deep, unshakable inner stillness. When he settled into his new, simple room, situated near the great university, the thick wooden shutters and heavy woven tapestries worked perfectly to soften the busy sounds of the outside world. The noise of wooden carts and calling vendors was gently transformed into a distant, muffled hum, feeling no more intrusive than the sound of a slow-moving river passing far in the distance. On cool, gray afternoons, he would sit quietly by his window, a heavy woolen blanket draped comfortably across his broad shoulders, simply listening to the steady, rhythmic murmur of the rain as it tapped lightly against the glass, perfectly secure and completely at peace within his quiet, dimly lit sanctuary. It was here, comfortably sheltered within the stone walls of the newly founded university, that Thomas encountered an entirely new and breathtaking world of thought, carefully opening the pages of ancient books that had traveled softly across the sea to reach his hands. He slowly discovered the writings of an ancient philosopher named Aristotle, whose works had recently been translated into beautiful, precise Latin, and reading these pages felt to Thomas like walking slowly into a vast, magnificent, and perfectly illuminated room. Where other students might have seen complex and challenging ideas, Thomas found a deeply comforting sense of natural order, a gentle and beautiful architecture of logic that explained the movements of the natural world with the same reassuring predictability as the quiet rising and setting of the sun. He would sit for hours at his heavy, polished oak desk, the soft amber glow of a solitary oil lamp casting a warm circle of light over the thick parchment, his mind absorbing the beautiful, harmonious relationships between cause and effect. He completely lost himself in the slow, peaceful joy of pure understanding, feeling the smooth, heavy pages turning beneath his fingertips with a soft, comforting rustle. The intricate philosophy of Aristotle did not disturb his deep, quiet faith, but rather provided a strong, stable foundation for his thoughts to rest upon, bringing a comforting realization that reason and faith could flow together gracefully, like two calm streams gently merging into a single deep and beautifully clear river of eternal truth. As he walked peacefully through the shaded stone corridors of the city, Thomas gradually began to notice a small, quiet group of men who moved with a special kind of gentle purpose, dressed in simple, heavy robes of unbleached white wool, gracefully draped with a long black cloak. These were the Dominicans, a relatively new brotherhood of humble, mendicant friars who had gently set aside all the complicated, heavy burdens of wealth, property, and status to devote themselves entirely to the peaceful pursuit of learning and quiet prayer. Thomas watched them from a respectful distance, feeling a profound, comforting resonance settling softly into his heart. His noble family, living far away in their great stone castle, had always harbored grand, heavy ambitions for his future, hoping that he would one day wear the rich embroidered silk robes of a powerful Benedictine abbot, carrying the immense weight of political influence and worldly honor. But Thomas felt absolutely no desire for such complicated things, knowing instinctively that true lasting peace was not found in the endless accumulation of power or possessions, but in the gentle, open-handed release of them all. He deeply admired the absolute beautiful simplicity of the Dominican way of life, softly imagining the profound physical and mental relief of simply letting go of all family expectations, finding an immense, warm comfort in the thought of owning nothing in the world but a few cherished books, and having a simple, quiet bed to rest in when the long day was finally done. Before formally asking to wear their humble garments, Thomas began to slowly spend his afternoons sitting quietly in the back of the Dominican chapel, absorbing the peaceful atmosphere of their shared life. He listened to their gentle discussions about the nature of the universe and the profound depths of divine love, feeling the words wash over him like a warm, soothing rain. The friars never pressured him to speak, completely respecting the vast, comforting silence that surrounded him like a soft cloak. In their quiet presence, he realized that a life devoted to learning did not have to be a loud, competitive struggle for academic prestige, but could instead be a deeply restful, continuous act of quiet devotion. He felt his mind settling softly into this realization, the way a heavy stone gently settles into the soft earth, resting securely exactly where it was always meant to be. The more he quietly observed the calm devotion of these humble scholars, the more his own path became beautifully and effortlessly clear, unfolding before him like a quiet country road without a single trace of anxiety or doubt. When he finally approached the friars to gently ask if he might be allowed to join their peaceful community, he did so with the tranquil, unwavering certainty of a tired traveler finally stepping through the familiar door of his own home. The Dominicans warmly welcomed the calm, silent young man into their peaceful, steady rhythm of daily life, and as Thomas first put on the heavy white wool of the Dominican habit, he felt a deep, grounding warmth wash slowly over his entire body. The rough, natural texture of the fabric resting against his shoulders felt wonderfully real and profoundly secure, serving as a constant, tactile reminder of his gentle commitment to a simple, unhurried existence. Wearing this humble, unadorned garment, he felt incredibly light and completely free, as if he had gently unbuckled a heavy, exhausting suit of iron armor and let it fall softly to the stone floor. While the news of his quiet decision would eventually travel back up the mountains to the towering walls of Roccasecca, bringing a brief, expected ripple of misunderstanding from a family who simply could not comprehend his choice, Thomas remained entirely untroubled and perfectly serene. He sat peacefully in the soft shadows of his small, quiet cell, breathing in the comforting, earthy scent of old parchment and warm beeswax, perfectly aligned with the steady, quiet calling of his own gentle heart, slowly and contentedly turning the page to the next beautiful chapter of his quiet life, perfectly safe and ready for rest. As the spring air began to gently warm the winding dirt roads of southern Italy, Thomas and a small, quiet group of his new Dominican brothers set out on foot, walking slowly northward toward the great city of Rome. The journey was peaceful, measured by the steady, rhythmic crunch of their leather sandals against the soft earth, and the quiet chanting of morning prayers as they moved through the rolling, sun-drenched hills. But the news of his gentle departure had already traveled back to his family, who still held on to their old, heavy dreams for his future. Unable to understand the deep, quiet calling of his heart, his mother sent his older brothers, the warriors of the noble family, to find him and guide him back home. When they finally met on the quiet country road, there was no loud conflict or harsh confrontation. Thomas simply stopped walking, looking at his brothers with a calm, understanding serenity. He offered absolutely no resistance, knowing that their actions were born from their own earthly worries and a desire to protect the family name. With his characteristic, unhurried grace, he quietly agreed to accompany them back to the ancient, familiar stone walls of his youth, allowing his long journey to gently pause. They brought him to the family's fortress, placing him in a quiet high room situated in a sturdy stone tower, far above the bustling daily life of the courtyards below. For his family, this was meant to be a firm intervention, a time for the young man to sit in isolation and reconsider the heavy, complex expectations they had placed upon his broad shoulders. But for Thomas, this enforced confinement was not a punishment at all. Instead, it was a profound and beautiful gift, a long, uninterrupted season of deep, restorative peace. The heavy oak door was locked softly behind him, and as the sound of the turning key echoed down the stone hallway, Thomas felt a tremendous, comforting wave of relief wash over him. He had absolutely nowhere he needed to be, no schedules to follow, no complex social obligations to fulfill, and no distant destinations to reach. He was completely safely enclosed within the thick, protective walls of his childhood, left entirely alone with the vast, quiet expanse of his own beautiful mind. The tower room was a perfect sanctuary for a soul that craved the slow, steady rhythm of silence. It was a simple, unadorned space, featuring a smooth stone floor swept perfectly clean, and a single, deep window that looked out over the vast, rolling green valleys and the distant, blue-misted mountains. Thomas would spend countless unhurried hours sitting in a heavy wooden chair by the window, completely at rest, watching the gentle transition of the seasons as the warm, golden days of late summer slowly gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. He watched the leaves in the forests below gradually turn from deep green to soft amber and pale gold, falling silently to the forest floor in the quiet afternoon breeze. Inside his room, he watched the dust motes dance lazily in the long, slanting shafts of late afternoon sunlight, floating suspended in the perfectly still air, catching the light like tiny, drifting stars. He found immense comfort in these small, quiet observations, allowing his breathing to slow and deepen, perfectly matching the gentle, steady heartbeat of the natural world resting quietly outside his window. He would wrap a heavy, warm woolen blanket around his shoulders when the stone walls grew cool, feeling the soft, comforting weight of the fabric, grounding him in the quiet present moment, perfectly safe and entirely undisturbed by the rushing world outside. As the days melted softly into weeks, and the weeks gracefully folded into months, the initial anxious energy of his family began to slowly dissipate against the immovable, peaceful center of his quiet resolve. His sisters, particularly the gentle Murata, began to visit him softly in his tower room, their initial worry gradually replaced by a deep, reverent awe for the profound serenity he radiated. Recognizing the beautiful sincerity of his chosen path, they began to quietly smuggle books up the winding stone stairs, bringing him the heavy, leather-bound volumes that his brilliant mind quietly craved. They brought him a large, beautiful copy of the ancient scriptures, the complex, systematic writings of Peter Lombard, and the newly translated, intricate philosophy of Aristotle. When Thomas received these books, he held them with a soft, reverent touch, feeling the comforting weight of the thick parchment and the smooth, worn leather bindings, deeply grateful for the quiet companionship of these ancient, brilliant voices. With the arrival of these cherished books, Thomas's days in the tower took on a beautiful, deliberate structure, a slow and peaceful liturgy of reading and reflection. He would sit for hours at a small, sturdy wooden table, completely absorbed in the quiet rustle of turning pages, while the pale winter light filtered softly through the high window, casting a cool, gentle glow across the room. He did not simply read the words, he absorbed them deeply, taking the complex, heavy ideas and turning them over slowly in his mind, examining every angle with a patient, unhurried focus. Because he had no other distractions, no urgent tasks calling for his attention, his memory expanded to hold vast oceans of thought. He slowly and peacefully memorized entire books of the Bible, tracing the beautiful, logical architecture of divine truth with the same steady, careful precision as a master stonemason carefully laying the foundation of a magnificent, enduring cathedral. When the evening shadows began to stretch long and dark across the stone floor, he would light a single, small candle, letting its warm amber glow create a safe, comforting circle of light around his wooden desk. He would continue to read, the soft, rhythmic movement of his thoughts flowing slowly through the text, finding a deep, restorative peace in the vast, unbroken silence of the sleeping castle. When the harsh, cold winds of winter slowly gave way to the soft, gentle rains of early spring, washing the valley below in a fresh, vibrant green, it became quietly evident to everyone in the noble household that Thomas would never change his mind. His gentle stillness was not the stubbornness of a rebellious youth, but the deep, unshakable rootedness of an ancient oak tree, perfectly content and secure in the quiet earth. Finally, exhausted by their own resistance and quietly moved by his peaceful endurance, slowly recognized that they could not hold the wind, nor could they keep this vast, brilliant mind confined within the stone walls of their expectations. The decision to let him go was made softly, without any grand announcements or dramatic farewells. The heavy oak door of his tower room was simply left unlocked, and the quiet expectation of his return to the world was softly acknowledged. According to the gentle, unhurried legends of the time, his sisters aided his final, peaceful departure, helping to lower him safely from the high window in a large, sturdy basket, while the rest of the castle slept soundly beneath a blanket of pale silver moonlight. Whether he floated slowly down the stone wall in the quiet dark, or simply walked peacefully out the heavy iron gates the next morning, the transition was perfectly smooth and entirely without resentment. Thomas carried no anger toward his family, understanding that their year together in the quiet fortress had been a necessary, deeply restful pause, a time of profound internal gathering and quiet preparation. He stepped softly back onto the dirt road, the morning air cool and refreshing against his skin, his mind perfectly clear, and his heart entirely at peace. He adjusted the heavy, comforting weight of his white wool habit, took a slow, deep breath of the fragrant, rain-washed air, and resumed his long, gentle journey northward toward the great, quiet libraries of Paris, carrying within him a vast and beautifully ordered universe of thought, ready to unfold slowly in the long, peaceful years ahead. The long, unhurried walk from the sun-warmed valleys of Italy up into the cooler, deeper green landscapes of northern Europe was a gentle progression, measured not by miles, but by the steady, rhythmic pacing of leather sandals upon the soft earth. Thomas traveled with a small, quiet group of his Dominican brothers, moving peacefully along the winding roads that slowly carried them toward the ancient, learned city of Paris. The air grew gradually cooler as they walked, the bright Italian sun giving way to the soft, comforting gray skies of the north. When they finally arrived at the great Dominican house of St. Jacques, the city was draped in a quiet, misty rain, wrapping the tall stone buildings in a gentle, atmospheric haze. Paris was the intellectual heart of the medieval world, a place where scholars from every corner of Europe gathered to explore the profound mysteries of existence. Yet for Thomas, the city simply offered another quiet room, another sturdy wooden desk, and another vast, peaceful ocean of thought to slowly explore. He settled effortlessly into the familiar, grounding rhythm of the convent, finding immediate comfort in the soft chanting of morning prayers and the deep restorative silence that filled the stone corridors long before the dawn. In the heart of this scholarly sanctuary was the lecture hall, a long, magnificent room characterized by its heavy oak tables and tall, narrow windows that let in the muted, silvery light of the Parisian afternoons. The atmosphere inside the room was one of deeply focused calm, smelling faintly of old wood, warm beeswax, and the rich, earthy scent of fresh ink resting in small clay pots. At the front of the hall sat Albert, a brilliant and gentle Dominican master who would later be known to history as Albert the Great. He possessed a vast, encompassing mind and a slow, steady voice that carried easily through the quiet room, carefully unraveling the complex threads of ancient philosophy and theology. As Albert spoke, the only other sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic scratching of dozens of quill pens moving smoothly across thick parchment, a soothing, repetitive hum of focused attention. Thomas sat near the back of this long room, his large, sturdy frame resting comfortably on the wooden bench, his head bowed slightly as he listened with a profound, unbroken stillness. To the other young scholars in the room, Thomas was a gentle mystery, a massive, quiet presence who seemed entirely disconnected from the lively, anxious energy of university life. While the other students would gather in the courtyards after lectures, enthusiastically debating the fine points of logic and eager to display their own cleverness, Thomas would simply walk slowly back to his small, quiet cell, perfectly content to remain entirely silent. Because he was so physically large, moving with a deliberate, heavy grace, and because he rarely volunteered a single word in the classroom, his peers eventually gave him a quiet, affectionate nickname, softly calling him the dumb ox. They assumed, not out of malice, but out of a simple misunderstanding of his nature, that the heavy, silent young man was simply too slow to keep up with the rigorous, demanding pace of Parisian scholarship. Thomas, of course, was perfectly aware of their gentle jokes, yet he felt absolutely no need to correct them or to defend his own intellect, finding a deep, secure comfort in the protective cloak of their lowered expectations. His silence was not an absence of thought, but rather a deep, expansive pool of quiet water, reflecting the world with perfect, undisturbed clarity. He did not feel the need to rush his understanding, preferring to take the heavy, complex ideas presented in the lectures and hold them gently in his mind, turning them over slowly, examining every facet in the safe, quiet sanctuary of his own reflection. He listened to the steady flow of Albert's words, absorbing the profound concepts of natural philosophy and divine truth, letting them settle deeply into the fertile soil of his memory. He wrote meticulously, his hand moving with a slow, practiced rhythm, transforming the spoken words into neat, orderly lines of dark ink on the smooth, cream-colored parchment, feeling a profound sense of peace in the simple, tactile act of recording truth. The gray light of the afternoon would slowly fade into the soft, purple dusk, and Thomas would simply close his books with a gentle rustle, his mind perfectly ordered and completely at rest, entirely untroubled by the opinions of the world around him. But Albert, observing the room from his elevated chair, possessed a much deeper understanding of the quiet, deliberate student who sat so peacefully in the back of the hall. He noticed the unwavering quality of Thomas's attention, the way his eyes remained gently focused, and the meticulous care with which he recorded his thoughts, sensing that a vast, brilliant light was hidden securely beneath the heavy, unassuming exterior. One particularly overcast afternoon, as the rain fell in a soft, steady rhythm against the leaded glass of the high windows, Albert decided it was time to gently invite the silent ox to share his thoughts. He asked Thomas to stand and respond to a complex, intricately woven question of theology, a problem that had left many of the older, more vocal students quietly confused. The room grew exceptionally still, the other scholars pausing their quills, expecting to hear the slow, fumbling words of a mind out of its depth, settling back onto their wooden benches with a soft rustle of woolen robes. Thomas rose slowly to his feet, his large frame casting a long, soft shadow across the stone floor, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, clear, and perfectly unhurried. He did not engage in loud debate or aggressive argument, but instead began to slowly build a response of breathtaking beauty and precision, laying out the foundation of the answer with the careful, steady hands of a master architect. He stated the question with perfect clarity, gently acknowledged the truth hidden within the opposing views, and then proceeded to resolve the difficulty step by step, his words flowing together like a calm, deep river finding its natural course to the sea. The logic was flawless, the phrasing elegant and simple, and the profound depth of his understanding washed over the room like a warm, golden sunrise slowly breaking through a heavy bank of morning fog. When he finished his thought, he simply bowed his head and sat back down on the heavy wooden bench, leaving the entire lecture hall wrapped in a stunned, reverent silence, the only sound remaining being the gentle, continuous patter of the rain against the glass. Following the lecture, a fellow student, perhaps still unsure of what he had just witnessed, approached Thomas quietly in the stone corridor, gently offering to help him review his notes, assuming the large man might still need assistance with the finer points of the lesson. Thomas smiled softly, thanking his brother for the kindness, and then proceeded to quietly recite the entire lecture from memory, not just repeating the words, but gently unfolding the concepts with perfect, luminous clarity, even suggesting ways the argument might be carefully strengthened. When this quiet exchange was reported back to Albert, the master simply nodded his head, a warm, knowing smile spreading across his face, recognizing that his gentle suspicion had been entirely correct. Gathering his students together in the soft, fading light of the afternoon, Albert spoke in a calm, steady voice, offering a profound observation that would ripple softly through the long centuries to come. He told them that they might call this quiet young man a dumb ox. But one day, the gentle, brilliant voice of this ox would carry a profound and beautiful wisdom that would be heard throughout the entire world, bringing a deep, lasting comfort to the minds of countless generations. From that quiet afternoon forward, the relationship between Albert and Thomas blossomed into a beautiful, steady companionship of the mind, a shared journey into the vast, peaceful mysteries of the universe. When the Dominican order asked Albert to travel eastward to the city of Cologne to establish a new house of quiet study, he naturally brought his brilliant, silent student along with him, knowing that their work together had only just begun. The journey to Cologne was another slow, peaceful walk through the ancient forests and winding river valleys of Europe. The two men walking side by side in their heavy white habits, entirely lost in calm, unhurried conversations about the nature of the stars and the profound, sustaining love of the Creator. They settled gracefully into their new home near the banks of the slow-moving Rhine River, where the days stretched out before them in a beautiful, unbroken rhythm of prayer, reading, and deep, restorative thought, perfectly content to remain in the quiet shadows, letting their minds expand softly and naturally into the endless, comforting light of divine truth. Perfectly safe and perfectly at peace, the transition from being a quiet student to a gentle master happened softly, almost imperceptibly, as Thomas simply continued his peaceful work in the quiet corners of the Dominican houses. He eventually returned to the warm, sun-drenched hills of Italy, moving slowly between the ancient stone walls of Naples, Rome, and Orvieto. Yet his internal world remained wonderfully unchanged, completely sheltered from the rushing noise of the papal courts and the complicated politics of the medieval world. His life settled into a beautiful, unbroken rhythm, a slow, steady heartbeat of prayer and contemplation that provided a deeply comforting structure to his days. Long before the sun even began to think of rising, while the rest of the city was still wrapped securely in the heavy, velvet blanket of night, Thomas would wake softly in his small, unadorned cell. The air was cool and perfectly still, carrying only the faint, earthy scent of ancient dust and cold stone, holding the world in a state of quiet suspension. Moving with his characteristic heavy, deliberate grace, he would strike a single match, watching the small flame flicker and grow until it cast a warm, comforting circle of golden amber light across his heavy oak desk. This solitary pool of light became his entirely peaceful universe, a safe harbor surrounded by the comfortable, enveloping dark of the early morning hours. He loved this deep, quiet time before the dawn, when the mind is perfectly clear and untroubled by the demands of the day, allowing his thoughts to unfold slowly and naturally like the petals of a flower opening in the cool, silent dark. Sitting comfortably in his sturdy wooden chair, he would gently draw his heavy woolen cloak closer around his shoulders to ward off the slight morning chill, settling completely into the absolute stillness of the room. He would begin his work, using a simple stylus to press gentle indentations into smooth wax tablets, the faint rhythmic scratching sound providing a soothing, repetitive hum that anchored him deeply in the present moment. When his thoughts gathered a quiet momentum, he would call softly for his trusted friend and secretary, Reginald, who would sit patiently beside him, the soft rustle of his heavy robes blending with the quiet breathing of the sleeping house. Reginald would sit with a freshly dipped quill, perfectly attuned to the slow, measured cadence of the master's voice. Thomas did not speak with loud authority or urgent passion, but rather murmured his dictations in a low, even tone, letting the heavy, complex ideas flow from his mind like a calm, slow-moving river finding its peaceful course through a quiet valley. The steady sound of the quill moving softly across the thick, cream-colored parchment became a beautiful, relaxing metronome, measuring the quiet hours as the black glass of the window slowly began to turn a pale, milky gray. It was within this deeply tranquil routine, surrounded by the comforting scent of warm beeswax and fresh ink, that Thomas began to slowly construct his masterpiece, a vast and beautifully ordered work known as the Summa Theologica. He did not write with the frantic energy of someone trying to prove a point, but rather worked with the patient, unhurried precision of a master builder, slowly constructing a magnificent cathedral of thought. Every day, he carefully shaped and polished a single idea, taking a complex theological question and turning it over gently in his mind until all its rough edges were completely smoothed away. He laid these thoughts down one by one, like large, perfectly cut stones, ensuring that each new concept rested securely upon the strong, unshakable foundation of the one that had come before it. He built beautiful, graceful arches of logic that connected the mysteries of heaven to the natural movements of the earth, creating a vast, spacious architecture where the human mind could safely wander and find deep, lasting rest. He took the profound, ancient wisdom of Aristotle and gently washed it in the clear, peaceful waters of Christian faith, weaving the two together so seamlessly that they supported each other like two strong, deeply rooted trees leaning gently toward the same quiet light. To Thomas, philosophy was not a chaotic battlefield of competing ideas, but a quiet, illuminated sanctuary where every truth, no matter how small, had its own perfectly designated place in the grand, harmonious design of the Creator. One of the most remarkable and deeply comforting aspects of his building process was the tremendous gentleness with which he treated the thoughts of those who disagreed with him. Before he ever laid down his own smooth stone of truth, Thomas would first carefully gather the arguments of his opponents, treating them not as enemies to be conquered, but as precious materials to be examined with profound respect. He would state their objections with perfect clarity and remarkable fairness, often making their arguments sound even stronger and more beautiful than they had originally been crafted. He possessed a rare and beautiful intellectual hospitality, welcoming every honest question into his quiet room and offering it a comfortable place to sit and be heard. Only after he had patiently listened to every voice would he begin to slowly weave his own response, gently untangling the knots of confusion and softly illuminating the path toward understanding, without ever raising his voice or displaying a single trace of intellectual pride. This methodical process of asking a question, listening quietly to the objections, and then calmly laying down the truth became the steady, rhythmic breathing of his life's work, a peaceful, repetitive cycle that brought a deep sense of order and safety to the vast, boundless landscape of medieval theology. Because his mind was constantly inhabiting these vast, quiet cathedrals of thought, Thomas often became wonderfully detached from the loud, demanding physical world around him, drifting softly into a state of profound, peaceful abstraction. He would walk slowly through the busy stone corridors of the Dominican houses, his large frame moving with a heavy, sleep-like grace, his eyes completely unfocused as he quietly worked through a beautiful, intricate problem of logic in his mind. The other friars would smile softly as he passed right by them without a single word of greeting, knowing that their gentle brother was perfectly safe, simply wandering happily through the peaceful, sunlit rooms of his own vast intellect. There were quiet afternoons in the refectory where Thomas would sit at the long wooden table, the sounds of wooden bowls and quiet reading echoing softly against the stone walls, completely forgetting to eat the simple warm bread placed gently before him. He would simply stare softly at the grain of the wood, lost in a deep, comforting meditation on the nature of angels or the beautiful, harmonious movements of the stars, until a brother would gently touch his arm, bringing him softly back to the present moment. Even when he was occasionally required to travel and dine at the grand, heavy tables of royalty, surrounded by the loud, elaborate conversations of kings and nobles, his mind remained perfectly anchored in its own quiet harbor. The legends softly recall a moment when, seated near the King of France, Thomas completely lost himself in a quiet revelation, gently tapping his heavy hand on the wooden table and softly whispering a beautiful resolution to a problem he had been carrying for days, entirely unaware of the royal company around him. The king, rather than being disturbed, was deeply moved by the monk's profound peace, quietly ordering that ink and parchment be brought immediately so the gentle scholar could capture his beautiful thought before it drifted away like a soft morning mist. This was a life entirely devoid of restless ambition or the exhausting pursuit of worldly recognition, a life built entirely upon the slow, comforting repetition of reading, reflecting, and quietly writing down the truth. The years melted softly together, the dark, quiet mornings giving way to pale, gentle afternoons, and the warm Italian summers slowly cooling into the crisp, quiet winters of the north, where the snow would fall silently outside his narrow window, muffling the sounds of the city and wrapping his room in an even deeper blanket of quiet isolation. Through it all, Thomas remained perfectly still at his wooden desk, the warm, amber candlelight continuing to hold back the dark. He found immense, restorative peace in this simple, unvarying routine, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, wrapped securely in the heavy white wool of his habit and the boundless quiet love of the Creator. And as the millions of words slowly filled the thick, smooth parchment pages, the great cathedral of his mind grew ever more beautiful and expansive, standing as a quiet fortress of order and grace, perfectly preparing his gentle soul for the profound and beautiful silence that was soon to come. As the slow, golden days of late autumn gently gave way to the crisp, cooling air of early winter in the year 1273, Thomas found himself living once again in the familiar sun-drenched city of Naples. This was the very place where his quiet journey with the Dominicans had softly begun nearly 30 years before, and returning here felt like a peaceful homecoming, a gentle closing of a long and beautiful circle. He was 48 years old, and the passage of time had gradually settled into his heavy frame, slowing his physical movements even further, wrapping him in an aura of profound, unshakable calm. He spent his early mornings in the familiar, comforting routine, sitting at his sturdy wooden desk long before the sun rose, working steadily on the final, magnificent chapters of his great work, the Summa Theologica. He was quietly turning his vast, brilliant mind toward the deeply comforting mysteries of the sacraments, gently exploring how the divine presence flows softly into the physical world, bringing grace and peace to the ordinary, tactile materials of water, oil, and warm bread. The days followed one another in a steady, unbroken rhythm, measured by the soft chiming of the Abbey bells and the quiet, continuous scratch of the quill moving gracefully across the smooth parchment. But those who lived closely with the gentle master began to notice a subtle, almost imperceptible softening in his demeanor, a deepening of his natural abstraction. He would occasionally pause in the middle of a sentence during his morning dictations, his eyes resting softly on the pale morning light filtering through the narrow window, completely lost in a quiet interior expanse that seemed to stretch far beyond the stone walls of his small cell. His faithful secretary, Reginald, would wait patiently by his side, his hands resting quietly in his lap, simply watching the profound stillness of his friend, intuitively understanding that Thomas was wandering through a vast, beautiful landscape of thought that words were slowly becoming inadequate to describe. Then came the dark, quiet morning of December the 6th, the feast day of St. Nicholas. The air in the city of Naples was cool and perfectly still, carrying the faint, earthy scent of ancient dust and the distant, soothing rhythm of the sea gently washing against the harder walls. Thomas walked slowly through the dimly lit stone corridors of the great chapel of San Domenico Maggiore, the heavy white wool of his habit whispering softly against the smooth floor. He took his place at the altar to celebrate the morning mass, the warm amber glow of a few solitary candles casting long soft shadows across the high, vaulted ceiling. The chapel was wrapped in a deep, reverent hush, the only sound being the low, rhythmic murmur of the ancient Latin prayers, a comforting melody that had guided his heart since he was a small boy resting in the quiet sanctuary of Monte Cassino. It was during this gentle, unhurried liturgy, while holding the profound, quiet mysteries of his faith in his heavy hands, that something unimaginably beautiful and entirely peaceful unfolded within the vast architecture of his mind. It was not a sudden shock, nor a dramatic, overwhelming vision, but rather a profoundly gentle, infinitely expansive opening of the soul, like a vast, heavy wooden door slowly swinging open to reveal a landscape bathed in pure, soft, and endless light. In that quiet moment, all the intricate, beautiful structures of logic he had so carefully built, all the millions of words he had so meticulously chosen and arranged, were completely illuminated by a serene and perfect truth. He saw the absolute reality that rested quietly behind all his arguments. A reality so vast, so comforting, and so deeply nourishing that it required absolutely no explanation, no defense, and no further thought. The heavy burden of trying to map the infinite was gently lifted from his broad shoulders, evaporating softly like a pale morning mist, melting into the warm, golden light of the rising sun. When the Mass was finally concluded, Thomas walked slowly back to his small, quiet room, his face pale and radiating a profound, unearthly serenity. The room looked exactly as he had left it just an hour before. The wax tablets lay waiting on the desk, the dark ink rested quietly in its small clay pot, and the thick cream-colored parchment was prepared for the long morning of dictation. Thomas simply stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly and deeply, feeling a tremendous, peaceful emptiness washing over him. He walked over to the wooden desk, looked gently at the tools of his lifelong labor, and with a soft, final exhale, he simply let his hands rest comfortably at his sides. The great, powerful engine of his intellect, which had turned so steadily and brilliantly for decades, gently and beautifully came to a complete stop. A short time later, Reginald entered the room, his quill ready, expecting the master to resume his slow, measured pacing and begin the day's work. But he found Thomas sitting peacefully in his chair, his hands resting quietly in his lap, his eyes gazing softly out the window at the pale blue morning sky. Reginald gently asked if they should begin, wondering if the master was simply feeling the heavy exhaustion of the long years. Thomas turned his head slowly, looking at his dear friend with a smile of such deep, radiant warmth and absolute peace that it seemed to soften the very stones of the wall. In a low, comforting murmur, a voice completely free of any sorrow or regret, Thomas spoke the words that would gently close the book of his life's work. He said simply that he could write no more, for he had seen things that made everything he had written seem like straw. He did not say these words with bitterness, nor did he feel that his vast life's work had been a failure. He understood, with perfect quiet clarity, the beautiful and necessary nature of straw. Straw is the golden earthly material that safely cradles the heavy, nourishing grain as it slowly grows in the sun. It is gathered into bundles to provide warmth against the winter cold, and it is laid down softly to create a comfortable bed for the weary traveler. Thomas had spent his entire life patiently gathering these golden straws of truth, arranging them systematically, building a magnificent, sheltering structure to comfort and guide the minds of countless others. But now, in the quiet twilight of his own journey, he had been gently given the pure, life-sustaining grain itself. He had tasted the absolute reality toward which all his words had only been pointing, and having found the quiet center of the universe, there was simply nothing left to say. For the next 3 months, Thomas lived in a state of absolute, uninterrupted silence and profound, restorative rest. He continued to walk softly through the stone cloisters, his heavy sandals making a slow, rhythmic sound against the ancient floors, attending the daily prayers and sharing the simple, quiet meals with his Dominican brothers. But the exhausting, relentless drive to write, to teach, and to endlessly explain the universe had entirely departed from his soul. It left in its place a vast, empty room filled only with a soft, diffuse, and perfectly peaceful light. The transition from intense, lifelong intellectual labor to complete, serene stillness was not a loss, but a beautiful final release, a deep and long-awaited exhale. It was the profoundly comforting feeling of a heavy, damp woolen cloak slipping gently from his shoulders at the end of a very long, very cold journey, allowing him to finally sit resting by the warm glow of a quiet hearth. The winter air in Naples was cool and refreshing, carrying the faint, salty mist from the harbor, and Thomas spent his days simply absorbing the quiet beauty of the world around him. He no longer needed to untangle the complex, anxious thoughts of the men who surrounded him. He only needed to exist. He spent long, peaceful hours sitting in the quiet chapel, or resting comfortably in the small garden, watching the soft, gray clouds drift slowly across the winter sky. His mind, once a bustling, perfectly ordered city of logic and philosophy, had completely transformed into a still, quiet lake, reflecting the heavens with perfect, unblemished clarity. He was entirely safe, entirely known, and perfectly at rest, happily enveloped in the golden, quiet silence that he had sought since he was a small boy, knowing with absolute certainty that his long, beautiful work was finally and completely done. Early in the gentle, quiet year of 1274, the peaceful rhythm of Thomas's life in the sun-warmed city of Naples was softly invited to turn outward one last time. A letter arrived from Pope Gregory carrying a quiet, respectful request for the gentle master to travel far to the north to attend a great council gathering in the distant city of Lyon. While the long, winding journey across the mountains and through the valleys would be a tremendous physical undertaking for a man of his size and years, Thomas accepted the invitation with the same calm, unhurried obedience that had guided his entire existence. He gathered his few simple belongings, taking only what was absolutely necessary for the quiet road ahead, and prepared to leave the warm, sunlit walls of his familiar sanctuary. Before departing, he took one last peaceful walk through the quiet stone courtyards of the Dominican house, feeling the soft, salty breeze of the Mediterranean Sea brush gently against his face, entirely at peace with the quiet closing of this chapter. He was 49 years old, and the passage of time, combined with the immense, unseen weight of his lifelong intellectual labors, had gradually settled deep into his heavy frame, slowing his steps and wrapping him in a profound, comfortable weariness. Accompanied by his faithful companion and secretary, Reginald, Thomas set out onto the winding dirt roads, stepping softly into the crisp, cool air of the Italian winter, moving at a gentle, measured pace that perfectly matched the steady beating of his own restful heart. The journey northward was not a strenuous march, but a slow, peaceful pilgrimage through the quiet beauty of the sleeping landscape, far removed from the loud, anxious politics of the world they were leaving behind. As they walked side by side, the rolling, gentle hills were beautifully draped in a soft, silvery morning mist, and the bare, sturdy branches of the ancient oak trees stood completely still against the pale, gray canvas of the winter sky. Thomas wrapped his thick, white woolen habit securely around his broad shoulders, feeling the deep, comforting warmth of the heavy natural fabric protecting him from the seasonal chill. He listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of their leather sandals crunching softly against the cold, firm earth, finding a deep sense of grounding in the simple, repetitive motion of walking step by step. He no longer felt the exhausting need to untangle the complex mysteries of the natural world, or to construct magnificent, towering arguments in the quiet space of his mind, and instead, he simply let the quiet beauty of the winter countryside wash over him like a slow, calming river. He observed the frost sparkling softly on the dormant grass, watched the heavy gray clouds drift lazily across the vast expanse of the sky, and breathed in the clean, refreshing scent of distant rain and cold pine needles. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Thomas began to feel his physical energy gently waning, a natural and entirely peaceful slowing down, as if his body, having carried the vast, magnificent universe of his thought for so many long decades, was finally and quietly asking for permission to rest. As they traveled near the quiet rural town of Maenza, this profound, heavy weariness settled completely over him, and Thomas peacefully acknowledged that his long journey was gently drawing to its natural close. They stepped off the main road and slowly made their way to the nearby Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, a beautiful, ancient sanctuary of pale, cool stone resting quietly in a secluded, wooded valley. The monks of the abbey, recognizing the gentle giant who arrived softly at their wooden gates, welcomed him with deep, reverent warmth, guiding him slowly through the dimly lit, silent corridors to the quietest, most comfortable room in the entire monastery. When Thomas finally lay down upon the simple, soft bed, a tremendous feeling of relief and absolute security washed over his entire body, the heavy, invisible burdens of the world slipping completely from his shoulders like a worn and heavy cloak falling to the floor. The room was a perfect, secure haven of peace, featuring a thick woolen blanket to keep him warm, and a single open window that let in the cool, gentle breeze of early spring, carrying with it the soothing, earthy fragrance of damp soil, old wood, and the distant, slow-moving river. As he rested his heavy head against the soft pillow, he could hear the distant, muffled voices of the monks chanting their evening prayers, a beautiful, rhythmic melody that echoed softly against the ancient stone walls, bringing his mind gently back to the quiet, secure days of his childhood at Monte Cassino, closing the long, beautiful circle of his life with perfect, harmonious grace. For a quiet, unhurried month, Thomas lingered peacefully in this comfortable room, while the harsh, biting cold of winter slowly melted into the soft, pale light of the approaching spring. He had no more heavy books to read, no more vast theological problems to untangle, and absolutely no desire to return to the complex, rushing world outside the thick, protective Abbey walls. His days were measured only by the slow, gentle movement of the sunlight, inching slowly across the smooth stone floor, and the comforting, constant presence of Reginald, sitting quietly by his side in the comfortable silence. On certain calm afternoons, when he felt a small, gentle spark of energy, Thomas would speak in low, softly murmured tones to the monks who gathered respectfully around his bed, offering a few simple, beautiful thoughts on the ancient poetry of the scriptures. He no longer spoke of complex, rigid logic or the intricate architecture of the universe, but only of the profound, simple, and all-encompassing nature of divine love, his words flowing softly and effortlessly like a calm stream gently returning to the deep, quiet ocean. He watched the first pale green buds gently appearing on the branches outside his window, and listened to the soft tapping of the spring rain against the glass, completely surrounded by a feeling of profound safety. He was fully aware that his life's work was beautifully done, that he had gathered all the golden straw he was meant to gather, and that he was now simply waiting, with absolute patience, for the gentle arrival of his final rest. As the quiet days of early March gracefully unfolded, his physical presence grew ever lighter, while the deep, restorative silence within him expanded to fill every corner of the tranquil room. He received the final, comforting sacraments of his faith with a peaceful, willing heart, his eyes resting softly on the faces of the brothers who cared for him with such tender, unhurried devotion. He felt absolutely no fear, no urgency, and no regret, only a vast, endless gratitude for the beautiful, slow unfolding of the world he had so deeply loved. The air in the room was completely still, thick with a deep, reverent peace, as the gentle scholar allowed his breathing to slow to a steady, shallow rhythm, perfectly aligned with the quiet, sleeping earth. On the early morning of March the 7th, while the world outside the window was just beginning to turn a soft, dusky blue, Thomas closed his eyes for the very last time, releasing a single, soft, and profoundly peaceful exhale. His passing was as quiet and deliberate as the turning of a parchment page, a completely natural transition from the dim, flickering candlelight of his earthly study into the pure, endless, and completely comforting light of eternity. He left behind a magnificent, enduring legacy that would quietly shelter the minds of countless generations to come. But for Thomas, the great, beautiful labor was finally complete, leaving only the profound, silent warmth of a soul that had safely and joyfully arrived exactly where it belonged. And so, the great book gently closes, the quiet settles over the stone, and the restless mind finally finds its long and perfect peace.